Welcome to the full story of Dune Messiah. In this video I will go over the main plot points and relevant details of what happens in the second part of the Dune series. I would also just like to say how this video is an unintended remake, since I already made a full story of this book previously. But during that time, I hadn't figured out the template and general structure of my videos. Something I only figured out later with the full story of Children of Dune. So this is basically a better version of that video. Not only because the whole video structure is now different, but also due to the fact that back then I wasn't taking the video too seriously. So I tried and failed a lot of bad humor and jokes and such, and it obviously didn't work. That video was bothering me. So I rolled the dice and decided that it had to be done. And here we are. I won't be unlisting the old video though, at least not right now, but I will remove it from my main Dune playlist in any case. Without further ado, let's talk about Dune Messiah. This novel was first released in 1969. Its story happens between the years 10,208 to 10,210 AG, around 15 years after the end of Dune. An interesting fact is that this is the shortest book out of the entire Dune series, being under 300 pages, while the first novel Dune was almost 700 pages. All the other novels in the series are between 450 to 550 pages each. For that reason, this feels more like the final chapters of Dune, since in Messiah we see the end of Muad'Dib Atreides' story, leading into the story of his children in the next novel. This next part of the series and all the others following it have already been covered here in my channel, so if you're interested, check out those videos I made. So once more, without further ado, here is the full story of Dune Messiah. The story starts with an interrogation of a man called Bronso of Ix. He was a historian who wrote about Arrakis and the Fremen. He wrote about how the sacred melange was an addictive drug which enslaved its users. He wrote about how Paul was first an Atreides in the Kvisets Haderach of the Sisterhood. He married Chani but didn't become a real Fremen. He would never become one. Paul ended up marrying Shaddan's daughter, Irulan, just so he could justify becoming emperor, and his jihad lasted 12 bloody years. Muad'Dib's priesthood decided that Bronso was indeed guilty for what he wrote, and that he should be executed for his heresies. It is mentioned that Paul's rebels used Bronso's analysis of history to denounce the sacred emperor, which is seen by the Fremen as heresy. After this first chapter is finished, we get to read a part of Bronso's analysis of history as the second chapter of the novel. Paul was trained in Bene Gesserit Prana Bindu secrets, just as he had received Mentat training. Those two combined with his genes resulted into the Kvisets Haderach, or as we could say, an unexpected latent Kvisets Haderach, an idea that will come back in later books. Paul commanded the Fremen and took down Shaddan IV in the Battle of Arrakeen. He gained a monopoly over spice and married Irulan to become emperor. His religious fervor was spread across Imperium by the Kizzarat, who led the jihad troops during those 12 years. The Kizzarat, which was a Fremen priesthood, were the ones who brought the Imperium under a single law, the law of Muad'Dib. Paul ended the feudalism of the Imperium, which reigned for longer than 10,000 years, and with the melange monopoly under his grasp, nobody could directly challenge the emperor. Melange was responsible for Paul's prescience, but it was also an addictive drug. His Fremen defeated the Sardaukar, the Harkonnen, the other greater houses united, and all the mercenaries contracted by the Lensred. Nobody was able to fight head-on against the Fremen, until they started to become overconfident after the end of the jihad. Many factors could be taken into consideration when it came to Paul's downfall. The Guild, the Ixians, the Bene Tleilax, All of them took part in this conspiracy against the Emperor. The spies within the Imperial Palace, Korba the Khazara, Chani's pregnancy problems. This analysis of history was written after Paul had walked into the desert, blind. So yes, the very first 2 chapters of the book spoil to us everything that is going to happen in this book. Well, that's a taste of prescience for us, the readers. Ceteo was a Tleilaxu face dancer. He had chosen the appearance of a round and unathletic man, but face dancers, as he was, could change their appearance to resemble anyone they wished. And contrary to his current appearance, they were swift and agile creatures, claimed to be uncompared even by the Bene Gesserit. Ceteo was received in Valak 9 by Gaius Helen Mohiam, the Reverend Mother who tested young Paul with the gun Jabbar. They discussed a way to get rid of the Emperor. The topic of using poison was touched. Present there with them was also a guild steersman called Edric, and I always pictured the steersman as looking like mermen, as in male mermaids, but the book describes him as looking almost non-human, like an alien, inside a large cube of gasified melange. And it is said that he speaks using a round box from one of the cube's corners. These steersmen are those who pilot the ships of the guild, seeing the path ahead into space with his prescience, to choose the safest route to anywhere in the galaxy. Irulan was also present there. She was the 4th conspirator. They spoke in Mirabassa, a language with emotional tonalities. And it was a cold day, for Valak was a harsh, icy planet with cold mountains. They eventually came to the conclusion that poison wouldn't work, for Paul had Bene Gesserit abilities. The sphere of influence of someone such as Edric, with his prescience, is a blind spot to another person with the same power. Edric never saw Paul in his visions, and so he believes that Paul won't be able to see their conspiracy. But this is a theory that they are still unsure if will work. Only time will confirm if they are safe or not. Irulan realizes that Edric's only function in their conspiracy is exactly that, to keep them hidden. And other than that, he was useless. Irulan wanted to be the mother of a royal dynasty, but since Paul only married her to become emperor, he had never touched her nor had shown any affection toward her. Irulan had been feeding contraceptives to Chani to prevent her from having a child, and she had been sending reports to the Bene Gesserit, something Paul knew about very well. Irulan was the least committed to the conspiracy, and the others wanted her full loyalty to the cause. The conspiracy could use the Chom to destroy Paul. They could use his mother, residing in Caledon, to destroy Paul. They could use the Kizarat to destroy Paul. They could use a ghost to destroy Paul. The Sardaukar commander who killed Duncan Idaho collected his body and sent it to the Bene Tleilax to create a Gola out of it, which is basically a homunculus made out of the dead cells of a person. That same commander and his troops died before ever relaying this relevant piece of intelligence to Shaddam IV. The Gola named Hate would be used to destroy Paul, for the conspiracy would control said Gola. Ceteo reveals to Mohiam that the Bene Tleilax once tried to create their own Kvisets Hadrach through genetic manipulation, but their creation ended up killing itself. My theory is that it saw the horrors of the future and wanted to take no part in it. Eventually, Edric realized that he was useful only to keep the conspiracy of Paul's prescience, and so he became completely quiet and stopped saying anything at all, since the other conspirators blatantly ignored him and disregarded everything he said. The Hate Gola who would be given to Paul was a Mantat and a Zen Sunni philosopher, and the guild would do the delivery part of this scheme. Along with the Gola, they would turn the Kizarat against Paul, and the Chom would follow wherever Prophet was at. That was the plan of the conspiracy, but unknown to each of the members of this conspiracy, they had secret plans and goals of their own. something we'll get to learn as the book progresses. Paul came back from another anonymous walk around Arrakeen. He usually did those at night, even if it was a dangerous thing to do. But it was the kind of danger he could manage as a Fremen. It was a privilege to walk the streets of Arrakeen without being recognized, for Paul dressed like a Fremen from the deep desert. He missed those days he and Chani were in the desert. Those were simpler times both he and Chani wanted to go back to. Paul was now at his bedroom, sitting on the edge of his bed. Chani entered the chamber with some glow globes and a coffee machine. But the coffee itself wasn't ready yet. That same coffee machine once belonged to Jamis, the first man Paul had ever killed in his life. Chani still looked like that dark-skinned fairy from the desert Paul had fallen in love with. She hadn't changed at all during these difficult years that have gone by. Paul looked at the poison snooper on their bedroom ceiling while thinking about the 12 years he had ruled as an emperor. Chani ordered him to lay down. By now he was contemplating their home. It was a simple apartment, not what one would imagine to be the home of the Emperor of the Universe. The only difference from their home to a normal Arrakeen house was that theirs had a garden and even an aquarium, things which were completely alien to the Fremen, a complete waste of precious water. Chani started talking to Paul about Irulan's desire to have his child. Chani had been unable to have another baby since the one they lost 12 years ago, but she doesn't know about Irulan's secret contraceptives. Chani came to a Fremen decision. Since she couldn't give Paul a new child, then Irulan had to do it for them. Paul's prescience was getting weaker. His visions weren't as strong as they once were. Melange didn't have the same effect on him as before. As the same occurs with any other drug, the more you use it, the weaker its effect hits you. Earlier that day, Paul and Irulan had a discussion. She wanted him to give her a child, an heir. But Paul knew that a child of Irulan would fall under the influence of the Bene Gesserit. Irulan could take any partner, as long as she didn't get pregnant. Chani was Paul's real wife, and that was something everyone knew. Chani listened in to that discussion, this being the reason she wanted to talk about this with Paul. Just like Paul, Chani also left the Imperial Palace dressed as a Fremen in a few occasions. But in her case, she took part in old Fremen rituals of fertility on the edges of the deserts of Arrakis. She tried her best to have Paul's child. Their discussion came to an end, as the stars of the night sky overcame the twilight. Shortly thereafter, a meeting was held by the Imperial Council. There was Stilgar, Korba, the leader of the Kizara, Alia, Chani, Irulan, and Paul. Stilgar was the one who held the documents they would talk about during the meeting. Before they started the event though, Korba blessed the pilgrims of Arrakis from the balcony of the Arrakeen Palace in Paul's place, for the Emperor despised doing that. Paul couldn't stop the jihad, and even if he died, his name would still command the Fremen. The Kizarat would make sure of that, since they were not only priests of Muad'Dib, but also spies and commanders of the jihadist troops. Stilgar took out a document on the Tupile Treaty, investments of the crown into a guild and landsred project, of which its location was still unknown to Paul. Tupile was a refuge for defeated houses and once enemies of Paul. This treaty had been in the making for 10 years now. Stilgar asked if Paul could use his prescience to locate Tupile, but he couldn't. During the meeting, Alia constantly provoked Korba. Both Paul and Alia felt the weight of the bloodshed under the Atreides flag. Korba was responsible for it as well, since he was the head of the Kizarat. Paul explains his prescience, and how it is like an infinite ocean. His visions have no limits, but they need to come to him. If Paul looks for Tupile, then Tupile would never appear to him. Korba listened to his every word with fanaticism, and anything Paul says will be sent as a report to the Bene Gesserit, since Irulan was there present with them. Paul's explanation was enough to satisfy Stilgar's question. Paul will sign the Treaty of Tupile. Another report sees the Ixians demanding less taxes and calling for the creation of a new constitution. This could have ended the jihad and saved Paul, but it was too late now. Paul prohibited a constitution and forced the Ixians to accept their taxes, as he will accept the Treaty of Tupile. Reports say Shaddam IV is training his single legion of Sardaukar in Seleucia Secundus, although his army couldn't do anything realistically, for they had no way to transport troops to Arrakis and the Fremen still outnumbered their numbers and strength. The topic of an heir to Paul came up. Irulan and Chani believed it was necessary for them to solve the subject. Paul walked around the room and then near the windows. He thought about the pilgrims who came from all around the Imperium to Arrakis, all under Muad'Dib's religion. Paul decided that it wouldn't happen. He and Irulan would not have a child. If Irulan loved him for real and wasn't under orders of the Bene Gesserit, then it could have been different between them. The last document Stilgar has is about a request for a guild embassy in Arrakis. They will send a Steersman as their representative, but Paul cannot see him with his prescience. But he can see where he's been and where he'll be. With this, Irulan finally has confirmed that their conspiracy is safe. Edric arrived in the presence of Emperor Paul Muad'Dib Atreides with a group of guild officials and a hooded figure. It turns out the hooded figure had metallic Tleilaxu eyes, and he was a Ghola of Duncan, Idaho. Alia was watching the whole event from an upper balcony within the audience room of the palace. Both she and Paul recognized Duncan upon laying eyes on him. Edric's square tank floated and was carried by two guild officials. They brought this Ghola as a gift to the Emperor after buying it from the Tleilaxu. It was said that this man had died in Arrakis with a wound to his head. They believed it to be Duncan, Idaho, and they were right. Due to his Mentat and Zensuni training, the Ghola is honest with Paul. He is a gift to the Emperor and will do whatever Paul asks him to. Gholas don't have memories of their past lives, but have glimpses of certain feelings, sounds, and actions they could have performed in a past life. He had been named by the Tleilaxu as Hate. His ability with the sword was improved as well. It is said that both this Ghola and the original Duncan had studied sword fighting in planet Genas, at the School Genas, the greatest school for swordmasters in the Imperium. School of which was founded by House Genas. The Tleilaxu created many weird and disgusting inventions. Sex toys, army commanders, philosophers, moralists, bizarre creatures among others. Stilgar and the Fremen guards were uncomfortable with Hate. They knew him. But Duncan had died. That man wasn't Duncan. He was a Jinn. Paul welcomed the guild and let them settle in the Arrakeen palace. They would talk later. Gaiozel and Mohiam had been arrested by Paul's men. She was inside the same transport which had brought Edric and his escort to Arrakis. Paul knew both Mohiam and Hate were baits. Hate admits that he is a weapon to destroy Paul, but he doesn't know how they plan on using him. There was something else hidden in that Ghola. Stilgar wanted to take Hate's water for his tribe, but Paul sent him to deal with Mohiam instead. Paul decided to keep the Ghola but also to be cautious about it. He had never seen this path in any of his visions, but he saw a terrible future with some Ghola in it. A terrible future he wanted to avoid. Alia, having watched the whole ordeal, felt sexually attracted to the Ghola. Hate was a danger to both Alia and Paul. Later, Edric and Paul were talking in a room with a map of Arrakis. A temple with Leto's skull was built and many pilgrims visited that sacred place. Edric had a strange assistant called Citeo, a man with a stupid appearance to his exterior but with perceptive eyes. The guild had given another gift to the Emperor, a show of Tleilaxo face dancers. They copied the appearances of characters from the Dune Tarot cards, and later those of Paul, Chani, and Stilgar. Stilgar despised the presentation and didn't stop complaining about it. Edric felt claustrophobic in that room. The guild steersman needed to be in open places, and that room was too small. Edric questioned if it was possible to destroy a god. Paul's followers saw him as one. Paul used fallacy and argumentation tricks to make Edric admit that he thinks that Paul is a fraud and his Kizarat are lying and manipulating people. Stilgar wants to execute Edric on the spot, but Paul prevents him. Edric questions Paul's prescience, but his words weren't directed to Paul. They were for someone else. The guards, Stilgar, and that Siteo assistant. Paul let Edric win this battle of words and ended their audience. The Siteo assistant talked to Paul before pushing Edric away. He compared Paul's Imperium to religion and how both had the power to unite isolated peoples and isolated planets under a single belief. After Edric and his assistant left, Stilgar and Paul went to talk in a dark corner near a window to Alia's temple. Korba arrived shortly after with historical documents of the Golden Age of Earth for Stilgar to read. Paul ordered those documents and wanted Stilgar to read them. Paul knew that Edric was part of a conspiracy that wanted Paul to destroy himself. Paul wanted Stilgar to study figures like Genghis Khan and Hitler. Genghis killed 4 million. Hitler killed 6 million. Paul killed 61 billion people, sterilized 90 planets, and exterminated the followers of many minor religions from the Imperium. Paul said it was impossible for anyone to ever surpass his death count, something he found funny and laughed at, for Paul remembered a memory of Hitler saying the same exact thing. Banerjee was the commander of Paul's security. They believed that disguised Sardaukar were amongst those who arrived with Edric. Paul ordered Banerjee and Korba to take care of a few vandals who invaded the Imperial Garden. That was to be done quietly, without raising attention. Alia had personal quarters in one of the towers of her temple. Alia's temple was built connected to the Arakin Palace and the high walls that protected it. Pilgrims from all around the Imperium came to her temple, and the crowds only got bigger with every new day. Alia despised all of those people and missed the old days before Paul became emperor. Alia ordered her Amazon guards to leave her alone while she took a bath. Even with the bath, she couldn't stop thinking about the Duncan Gola. He was too attractive. She reminded herself how before the Bene Gesserit, humanity never made long-term plans, never thought beyond a generation or two. Her other memories knew this, and also knew that feeling of attraction she had for the Gola far too well. Alia decided to train with an Ixian machine full of prisms. Alia believed that if she got tired that way, she wouldn't think about hate anymore. Alia trained while still being naked and wet from the shower. The prisms created illusions while the swordman fought and defended against a real blade. That machine could kill. The best swordmasters of the Imperium never passed level 7, but Alia had reached level 11. Paul and Stilgar entered the room, and her brother threw a knife at the off button of the machine to stop Alia from hurting herself. Both Paul and Stilgar saw Alia naked. There was no point in her hiding herself at all. Paul admitted he once reached level 10 before Gurney stopped him. But Stilgar was quick to realize that Alia did this stupid thing because she needed a man. Paul understood it was because of hate. The Gola was a danger to both of them, indeed. Irulan gave them intelligence that the guild may be trying to steal a sandworm and get it to some other planet to break the Arakian monopoly over spice. That's why they came to talk to Alia. They had to solve this problem and she would help them to do so. Siteo would meet a man who was once a Fremen of the Deep Desert in a neighborhood in Arrakeen. Siteo's disguised name was Zal, and that neighborhood was built for veterans of the Jihad. Otheym was one of the inhabitants there. He was hanging outside his house with his Tleilaxu dwarf Bijaz when Siteo arrived there. Farak was the name of the man who would meet Siteo. Both Farak and Otheym were once Fedaykin and both had fought alongside Paul before he became emperor. Farak apparently lost his arm in the Jihad. It is described that his clothing there is vacant, but I'm not so sure if this is really what this description means. Frank never directly describes that Farak lost an arm, and in many separate descriptions during this chapter, it is said that he has 2 hands. So probably this is just the readers misinterpreting the work, or could also be an actual mistake by Frank, who knows. Once together, Siteo and Farak entered the house. Farak's son was blind and played Semuta music with a belly set. Farak's son became blind because of a stone burner attack when the Jihad conquered Narash. Stone burners are a type of nuclear bomb that can even destroy a planet depending on how much fuel it has. Tleilaxu artificial eyes were granted for the Fremen affected by stone burners, but Farak's son rejected them, for it was a sin to unite man and machine in such a way. Siteo needed information on how it was like inside Muad'Dib's palace. Farak is described as having 2 viney hands, and that's an interesting detail, as I said previously. In this part, Farak just goes on a rant about missing the old days and old customs of the desert. Humans were used as distrans under Muad'Dib, while before him only animals were. Farak was against the Jihad. He only joined so he could be able to see an ocean, something he finally did in planet Ainfail. And again, it is described that he has 2 hands. Most Fremen only joined the Jihad for money, glory, and to see the oceans, not to spread Muad'Dib's divinity. Farak gave Siteo enough information for the conspiracy to infiltrate the palace and steal a sandworm, as so to break the Arrakis' monopoly over spice. Siteo then killed Farak and his son with a secret poisonous needle. Otheym's daughter got addicted to Semuta and spent her time with Farak's son listening to him playing Semuta music, and that day she was present at Farak's home. Siteo took the girl, for she would be used in his secret plan. It was common for bodies to be found in the desert, but this time, the dead body of a Fremen girl with Semuta drug and Tleilaxu poison traces was found. This was way out of the ordinary, and for that reason, Paul sent Hate and Alia to investigate. The body had been damaged by a Coriolis storm. Its hands and head were missing. There was probably no genetic archive of that woman anywhere, and for those reasons, they would never be able to identify who the body belonged to. They got back inside an ornithopter and went north back to Arrakeen. The topter flew over by El Quds, the place where Leto's skull was located at. Hate had glimpses of memories, short visions, and at such a place he remembered Duke Leto, his friend. Knowing who he really was had a huge importance for the Ghola, but he doubted if he really was Duncan Idaho. Alia knew Duncan's mannerisms very well and was sure that this Ghola was of him. After circling El Quds for a while, they went back and arrived in Arrakeen. Discussing while doing so, Alia ordered Hate to use his Mentat rationality. Hate knew neither Paul nor Alia liked the cult created around them, for they weren't gods. Hate was completely sincere to Alia and Paul, and if the Fremen guards were to hear his words, they would kill him for heresy. Before they left the ornithopter, Hate kissed Alia, a kiss they both wished for. Their conclusion after going to the desert was that a Tleilaxu face dancer was behind the assassination, for a Fremen girl had died out there and nobody noticed a missing girl anywhere within the palace. Paul had a nightmare, a bloody moon falling from the sky. He woke up and it was midday. He struggled to understand the dream. Paul took a walk outside in many gardens of his Arrakeen palace. The flowers' smell was great, but they weren't enough to take his mind off the nightmare. The Emperor looked over Arrakeen, a city he despised. Most of the modern-day Arrakeen had been built on top of the battlefields his Fremen had defeated the Sardaukar. So many lives were lost in the Battle of Arrakeen, and now his people were wasting water as if it had no value at all. The Fremen were forgetting their ways. Colossal buildings greater than those of Damascus and Baghdad were risen in Arrakeen. His palace was the largest building ever made by humanity. It could even fit inside castles and palaces of other great rulers. While immersed in these thoughts, the Ghola appeared to Paul out of the shadows. The Emperor explained his dream to Hayt and asked for his Ensuni and Mentat interpretation of it. Hayt told Paul that he couldn't live the present for he was too worried for the future. Paul feared that which he could not control. Paul feared his visions of the future. Gaius Mohiam suspected the guild had betrayed her. A Kizara with a shaved head and a troop of Fremen guards arrested her while the ship was still in orbit. As Mohiam was in a cell, Irulan came to visit her. Mohiam had a Dune Tarot card collection and kept consulting her luck with it. "I want this merch, where can I buy it?" Irulan and Mohiam talked with words so that the Fremen could hear them, but in secrecy, the real conversation was through hand gestures, avoiding the guards listening in to them. Mohiam was disappointed that Irulan wasn't pregnant yet. Irulan reveals that Chani started a Fremen diet and was getting more fertile. There was no opportunity for contraceptives to be given to her. Mohiam says that they couldn't lose Paul's genes with a wild Fremen woman. Her pharaoh genes could screw Paul's Kvisset's Hadrach genes and undo thousands of generations of Bene Gesserit hard work. Mohiam wanted incest between Paul and Alia to preserve his genes. Great, what we need is certainly the Habsburgs. Sometimes the Bene Gesserit seem a bit dumb, or you could just brush it off as them being too desperate. Anyway, Mohiam also ordered Irulan to assassinate Chani. She wanted Irulan to sacrifice herself to prevent Chani from having a child. But at the same time, Mohiam treats her like garbage and is rude to her. Irulan decides to do her own thing. She won't follow Mohiam's orders anymore. Some time passed and Mohiam was being brought by a group of Fremen guards to the presence of the Emperor. The guards purposefully made her walk a long distance through the Arrakeen Palace just to tire her up. The Arrakeen Palace was the biggest construction ever built by humanity, and eventually, after a long walk, the Reverend Mother arrived inside the biggest room ever made by humanity, Emperor Paul Muad'Dib's reception room. That room gave the illusion that whoever entered it was an ant and that the Emperor was gigantic. Paul was on his throne. Stilgar, Alia and Hayt were with him, but Irulan and Chani were missing. The Fremen guards were near the walls. All of them had crysknives, but some had Maula pistols and others lasguns. Paul had a protective shield around him, so those with the lasguns must have been trustworthy soldiers. Paul brought Mohiam to a small room behind the great throne. In there, he wanted to negotiate Chani's life with the Bene Gesserit. Paul would give his seed to the Bene Gesserit, so they could artificially impregnate Irulan. In trade for that, the Bene Gesserit wouldn't try to assassinate Chani anymore. as Paul knew they wanted to do that. Chani was now pregnant, something Paul had discovered only 2 days ago. Artificial insemination was against the ideas of the Butlerian Jihad and the Sisterhood. They would have Paul's genes, but they would lose the throne, and they would have to go against their own beliefs. It was too much for one Reverend Mother to decide, so Otheym asked for some time so she could talk to the council from Valak 9. Paul and Chani's child would be born in Sietch Tabr. Stilgar took the old witch away. Paul, alone with Alia and the Gola, cried. This path he had chosen would lead to Chani's death. There was no other way to do this. Seteo came to meet Edric in secrecy. He told the Steersman that he needed to stimulate the Gola, whatever that meant. Both of them knew that their alliance and their conspiracy was crumbling. The Bene Gesserit were already out of the conspiracy, due to Paul's offer to them. Seteo knew their conspiracy was weak, but the Tleilaxu had a different plan, hidden from the rest of the members of the conspiracy. Seteo understood that Paul didn't use the jihad. He wanted to stop it, but he couldn't. Edric was more scared of Alia than he was of Paul. Seteo knew that even if they take out Paul, their Fremen and Alia problem wouldn't be solved. Seteo would kill Edric if he could, but that would compromise the conspiracy. Edric was just too stupid to understand how complicated the situation really was. He believed that just by killing Paul, everything would go back to what it was before the jihad. But in truth, nothing would ever be the same ever again. Their meeting was done as for now, and on each path they followed. Paul and the Gola trained while waiting for Chani's arrival back from the clinic. The doctors discovered that she had been fed with contraceptives for a long time before she had changed her diet. Chani knew Irulan was behind this and she wanted her blood. Paul knew about that all along, and Irulan, by doing that, was saving Chani's life. For once she gives birth, it will be her death, and that was a future impossible to be avoided. Paul ordered Chani not to kill Irulan, and so Chani obeyed him. Chani still didn't trust the Gola, who was there present with them. Hate was a mentat. He was sincere, and although he knew he was a tool to take down Paul, he helped the Emperor in any way he could to avoid that fate. Hate wished to have his memories back, as did any other Gola ever made. Many attempts had been made in the past by the Tleilaxu, but none succeeded. No Gola ever got their memories back. Paul questioned Hate and showed the man present in that Gola body to Chani. After this personal display, Chani started to think that she could trust Hate. This Gola was once the man Duncan Idaho, eternally loyal to the Atreides and close friend of Paul Atreides. After this interaction was over, Paul felt like he was distancing himself from Chani, and that she couldn't understand him anymore, like how she once did when they were closer, when things were easier. Chani seemed far too distant already. Paul accepted to trade the life of his loved one for the life of his heir to the throne. Lichna of Berk al-Dib, daughter of Otheym, came to visit the Emperor in his palace. She claimed that she had information only for his ears. From the moment Paul laid eyes on her, he knew that she was a face dancer in disguise. Banerjee was together in the room with them. His ancestors were smugglers, but he started serving the Emperor as part of the Fremen civil guard. He raised among the ranks, and nowadays was trusted by both Chani and Paul. Paul knew that this face dancer disguised as Lichna was another bait, a trap, so he needed to be careful. Seteo wanted Paul to bring Chani to Otheym. There they would kill her and blame Paul for it. Unknown to him, Paul knew about this plan as well. Lichina told Paul that her father needed to solve a matter of water with him. This confirmed Paul that other Fremen were together in this conspiracy against him. Paul needed to follow this path so that his visions ended with his heir safe. So in the end, he accepted to visit Otheym, but alone, without Chani, since he knew he would lose her if he brought her along. Otheym's wife was once a Sayadina. She could witness them in place of Chani, and against that, Lichina had no argument. Banerjee had men who knew where Otheym lived. Paul gave him a secret code about how Lichina was to be placed under surveillance, due to her disguise and potential danger, without letting the face dancer know about this order. And with that, their meeting was over. And the night came when Paul went out to meet Otheym while disguised as a Fremen of the deep desert. Arrakeen was under the complete darkness of night. But the city was still alive and filled with movement. Ornithopters were silently flying around and selected men were patrolling the streets. They all knew Paul's location with a transmitter and were ready to act if anything were to happen to their Emperor and Messiah. People from the big city avoided Paul and were careful around him, for Fremen of the deep desert were easy to become enraged and to attack the people from the cities. Arrakeen showed both signals of Fremen decadence, but also as something from the desert, still respectful to that culture. It so happened that Paul got in the middle of a crowd of people and was pushed inside Alia's temple against his will. Rasir, his guide to Otheym's house, met him there, in the middle of the crowd. He was an old companion from the times of the siege Paul had forgotten about. A ritual was taking place in Alia's temple. She appeared and played her part, drinking a lot of melange essence and having visions for the people. Although Paul knew about everything that was going to happen in that ritual, he watched it like the pilgrims did, from the middle of the crowds. A completely new perspective he hadn't had before. After Alia answered a bunch of dumb questions and gave hints that she knew Paul was among the crowd, the ritual ended. That night it had been shorter than expected. Rasir helped Paul to leave the temple and go over to Otheym's house. After leaving the Emperor there, he disappeared into the darkness. Paul's guards would take the old man and interrogate him later. The street ended up ahead and houses surrounded the location. Paul saw how those who were once his Fedaykin were wasting too much water. Too neglectful they had become. Few were those who remembered how it was to live in the desert. Eventually, it would rain in Arrakis, and Paul knew that. At Otheym's house, a dwarf named Bijaz received Paul and welcomed him inside. Paul had not seen this dwarf in any of his visions. He was somehow a blind spot. Bijaz brought Paul to Otheym and his wife. Duri was her name. She was taking care of her husband. Their house seemed far too empty, for they had sold most of their belongings and articles from the desert. Things very valuable to foreigners, to pay for Otheym's medical care. The old Fedaykin had the left side of his face covered in scars. His eye there couldn't open properly and his teeth on that side had been replaced with metallic ones. Otheym had gotten a disease in Tarahel. He would soon pass away because of it. Paul offered to get doctors for them, but they rejected the offer. They had already paid for the best ones. Very expensive they were. Otheym had distanced himself from Usul so that he could get among the Fremen who despised him and were making plans to take him down. Bijaz was a human distrans and had the name of all the Fremen traitors. Those traitors had a house at the end of the street. It was probably Farrak's house he was talking about here, although the book doesn't specify on that detail. They knew Otheym was poor. Paul living with a dwarf was part of the disguise. for he would seem like somebody who came to buy Bijaz. Duri called the dwarf and gave him to Paul. Bijaz spoke nonsense and told many riddles to the other characters. Paul understood that Bijaz was prescient, and for that reason he couldn't see the dwarf in any of his visions. Otheym and Duri believed Lichna to be safe. They didn't know she was dead for a long time already. Bijaz was nervous. He knew something was about to happen, and that something was confirmed by Paul's visions. They left the house, for it was time. Paul and Bijaz were on the streets of Arrakeen. Stilgar came from the shadows and Paul gave him Bijaz, explaining the dwarf's importance to him. After Stilgar was gone, Fremen soldiers appeared all around the neighborhood, some protecting Paul, while some others went over to Otheym's house and near where Farak lived. As Paul had foreseen, a stone burner exploded at the end of the street. It destroyed completely Farak and Otheym's houses. Many Fremen soldiers would go blind because of that, Paul himself included. My theory is that the stone burner itself doesn't make people blind. Not as in its light, like a nuclear weapon from our real world. My theory is that the stone burner's radiation makes people blind, no matter if you looked at it when it exploded or not. For example, after it explodes here, Paul doesn't go blind immediately. It takes him some time before everything goes black. Paul was blinded, but he could still use his visions to see. Stilgar had escaped and soon ornithopters and other Fremen came to the rescue. Paul ordered so that all of the blinded Fremen would gain free Tleilaxu metallic eyes. The stone burner used atomic fuel, and for that, the Great Convention ordered that all great houses should unite to punish whoever used that nuclear weapon against Paul. This would unite the lands red, and Paul would have one less enemy. Paul, blinded, went up to an ornithopter and gave orders to his men just by using his prescience, as if he weren't blind at all. All of his Fremen, Stilgar included, were speechless to see that. Paul was a god walking among men. Paul's eyes became two black holes in his face on the aftermath of the stone burner attack. It was hard for Chani to accept Paul's condition. Chani had discovered that she would have twins. The doctors had told her about it, but whenever Paul talked about her pregnancy, he talked as if they would only have one baby. They still loved each other, but Chani felt as if they didn't have any more time left to be together. Alia received a letter from Jessica. Her mother had prohibited Caladan from receiving pilgrims and criticized Alia and Paul's authoritarian and religious government. It would one day bring their own destruction. Alia's Amazon guards escorted her to the council room. These Amazon guards would become even larger in Children of Dune, and in the future, the essential military force under the God Emperor, just with a different name. But that's beyond the scope of this book, so let's go back to the trial. Alia met with Stilgar. Korba was in their presence to be judged by his crimes. He had been arrested, for he was part of the conspiracy against the Emperor. A Naib council was also present, and Alia would take note of those among them who could be in together with Korba's conspiracy. Their enemies had Fremen allies, and those needed to be identified and exterminated. While the stone burner attack happened, Korba's associates destroyed Quanats, poisoned water reserves, and even stole a sandworm to off-planet in an attempt to create another Arrakis to break the Atreides' monopoly over spice. About the sandworm, unfortunately, it is never described what happened to it. My theory is that they tried to turn Seleucus Secundus into a new Arrakis. Of course, it failed completely. I believe this because it is described in Children of Dune that some centrals are multiplying in Seleucus deserts, but they were unable to ever produce any spice and eventually died out. But whatever. Going back to the story, Paul came into the council. The Nabes wanted him to follow the Fremen law that ordered the blind to be left to die in the desert. But Paul could still see with his visions. So he described some of the Nabes from the gallery, an action which shut them up with religious aura. Korba claimed to be innocent. They discovered that Korba was the one who built the stone burner in Terahel and imported it to Arrakis. Korba called for the Fremen law. Stilgar stepped forward to be his defense lawyer. Alia suspected that Stilgar could be a traitor as well. But later, both her and Paul understood that Stilgar only came to Korba's defense so that he could privately torture Korba to get as much information as he could out of him. The trial was over. Alia identified the other traitors among the Nabes. Another arm of the conspiracy was chopped off. Paul sent Hate to interrogate Bijaz. The dwarf told Hate that he was there when they put Duncan's body inside the axolotl tank to regenerate his cells, and that he was there when they took him out. Bijaz is cryptic and never gives a straight answer to the Ghola. Bijaz's words get inside Hate's mind. The Ghola finally realizes that he was Bijaz's target, not Paul nor Chani. The dwarf starts singing and paralyzes Hate. Bijaz has the ability to order and control Hate around. The Ghola will do whatever the dwarf implants in him. Chani will eventually pass away, and with that, Hate will convince Paul to get a Ghola of her from the Tleilaxu. Paul had Harkonnen blood, from his mother's side. It wouldn't be hard for Duncan to kill a Harkonnen, would it? Paul would have to abandon his divinity and his claim to the throne, give all of his chom stocks to the Bene Tleilax, and escape away to a distant planet with his Chani Ghola. That would be the price the Tleilaxu would demand from him. Bijaz ends their conversation by ordering Hate to forget everything that just happened, and so the Ghola forgets it all, except for the impulse from within himself. Hate, back in control and blissful of what just happened, just says that Bijaz is trying to confuse him. Alia drank the largest amount of spice essence she ever had before leaving her temple to meet with Hate. Alia wanted to see what would happen with her brother and what would happen in the future. For that reason, she had drank that huge dose of melange. The Ghola saw her leaving her temple. Hate thought to himself how she didn't belong in that place, Arrakeen. Alia belonged in a desert, like a real Fremen. Hate had just come back from interrogating Bijaz, but kept his attention on Alia. When they were together, Alia started feeling sick. The melange brought her visions of a child she would have in the future. She couldn't see who the father was, though. Maybe Paul? Alia saw Duncan as a child, a teenager, and an old man. She saw him in many different periods of his life, just as she saw herself in those same periods as him. Alia knew that Hate loved her. The Ghola wanted to call the doctors, but Alia ordered him not to. Only when she fell partially unconscious, Hate did so. A Fremen doctor came to attend her. After she felt a bit better, Alia sent him away. There's a key moment when Alia says the word Hate, but the Ghola Hate thinks that she is calling him. Alia makes the Ghola admit that he loves her, for she also wants to be his woman. Alia knows that this child she will have in the future will be awakened, pre-born, just like how she is. Alia saw everything that was going to happen to Paul. It was too late to change the course of what was going to happen in the future. Paul would destroy himself, and that was unavoidable. Chani looked toward the desert. Night was falling. She was alone with the desert once more, looking out from Sietch Tabr. She was about to give birth. Chani thought about the weird companions Paul had brought along with them to Sietch Tabr. Gaius Ellen Mohayam, Edric, Lichna, Hate, Alia, Irulan, Stilgar, and his wife Hara, and finally Bijaz. Chani looked over the quanads and plantations and began to despise all the water she was seeing there. It was a poison, a parasite in Arrakis, and she wished back for the old days of the desert. After seeing a sandworm in the distance, strong winds hit Chani. A Coriolis storm was coming from far away. Hate called for her to come back inside the siege. Chani felt a bad smell coming from nearby. In Fremen culture, bad smells are omens of terrible things to come. Hate showed how he really worried for Chani's safety, and she decided to finally trust him, and they went inside the siege for protection. Once inside the siege, the place seemed alien to Chani. It was no longer the home she remembered. Paul was supposedly occupied with matters of the state, and for that reason he wasn't with Chani. The time came for Chani's babies to be born, and Hate helped her to move over to a proper place. Chani noticed how the Ghola was starting to panic. After she was with the servants and being prepared for labor, Hate got alone in a corridor. This panic didn't come out of nowhere. Something had happened to him. After computing with his mentat abilities, Hate realized that Bijaz had implanted some sort of impulse in him. Some trigger. Something related to Paul losing Chani. He neared an abyss. Just as Chani was outside the siege looking up at the night sky, Paul later did that as well. So much had changed in Sietch Tabr. Too much water was present there. Paul signed the Treaty of Senbo and sent away a servant, knowing very well how scary it seemed for this blind emperor to correctly sign the document and give it back to the servant's hands without having his eyes. Paul despised his Imperium. He despised his servants and despised his enemies and allies. None of them would ever understand him. Paul was trapped inside his own mind, his own prescience. Hate united with him outside the siege, in the darkness. The Ghola explained his theory that Bijaz implanted some trigger in him. Paul told him how he wished he never gained this damned prescience. Hate was confused and ended up calling Paul as young master, just like how Duncan did in the past. Paul gave water to the dead. He cried over the happy memories he had with Chani. Paul heard in the distance how Chani first called for her Usul. Then he heard their baby crying. Later, Tandis, a Fedaykin, came to warn Paul that Chani had passed away. Paul repeated to Hate how his beloved was gone, and this interaction was the trigger for the Tleilaxu impulse implanted in Duncan. Hate grabbed his knife, about to stab Paul, but the memories of Duncan overcame those of the Ghola, and Duncan took over control of his body, without harming Paul. Duncan got all of his memories back, even those of his death. He was the first Ghola to do so in all of history. While all this crazy shit happens, Tandis and a bunch of Fremen are just standing on the side. Apparently they didn't care for the safety of the Mahdi. After this happened, Tandis asked Paul if he and Duncan wanted to see the babies. This took Paul as a big surprise. How there were babies instead of a single baby. Paul had not seen two babies in any of his visions. Only a single one, a girl. Chani died giving birth, but her children were safe and Alia was together with Chani's friends. Paul's vision began to waver. He could not be guided by his prescience anymore, for Paul had become an actual blind man. Hara helped Paul meet his boy and girl. Then he was brought to Chani's body. This path was the least violent one that Chani could have gone away, for his visions showed many terrible futures where the conspiracy killed both Paul, Chani and their children. One of these futures had Chani and his children crucified and the Atreides name becoming a curse. Alia brought Lichna, who revealed herself to be the Tleilaxu face dancer Siteo. He quickly got close enough to the babies to assassinate them. Siteo wanted to negotiate with Paul. Just how Duncan Idaho came back, Siteo promised he could also bring Chani back. Paul knew he would become an eternal slave of the Tleilaxu if he accepted this, and that Chani would live a miserable life under the Kizzarat's venomous religion. Paul asked Alia to negotiate with Siteo while he tried to calm down and think a way out of this mess. Suddenly, he had a vision, eventually realizing that he was seeing through the eyes of his baby son inside the crib, right behind Siteo. With that perspective, Paul could see himself. He took his crysknife out and with his Mentat calculations and Prana Bindu strength, threw his knife at Siteo, hitting his head and killing the face dancer. I find funny how the way the book describes Siteo dying and falling backwards is so much longer than the descriptions of the final battle of the previous book. But jokes aside, the creature was dead. Everyone calmed themselves down. Paul's son talked to him through telepathy. Paul wondered why is it that he could see with his son's eyes and that they could talk to each other. My theory is that Chani's undocumented genes managed to create the true Kvisitz Hadrach the Bene Gesserit were seeking for generations. A Kvisitz Hadrach born with his power. This is why Paul couldn't see his own son in his visions. Paul was a latent, or how I like to call it, an artificial Kvisitz Hadrach, who was conditioned with Bene Gesserit and Mentat training, along with the Spice Agony, to awaken his powers. Something, of course, his son didn't require to attain the same powers. Chani's body was taken away for her water to be given to the tribe. Paul decided to name his son as Leto II, his daughter as Ganima. Ganima was the Fremen word for a spoil of war. Although Siteo was dead, there was one less temptation for Paul to deal with. Bijaz, the Dwarf. The little creature promised to bring back beloved Chani, but Paul ordered Duncan to kill the little shit before he accepted the offer. And so, such order was carried swiftly. Idaho was looking out into the desert when Tundis came back. It was night time and Tundis had just left with Paul to the desert, but the Fremen had returned alone. The blind emperor walked into the desert, respecting the Fremen custom to leave behind the blind for Shai Hulud. Paul was finally free. He would soon be together with Chani. Idaho sat down to think about Paul. He remembered once when he and young Paul visited a coastal market in Caladan. He remembered how Gurney Halleck used to play the Belisat for them. He remembered the good old days before they were forced to move to damned Arrakis. The Fremen said that Paul would never go away, that his presence would walk around the deserts of Arrakis forever. Duncan looked over the horizon when Stilgar came to talk to him. Stilgar shared how Alia became the new government, a regent before the twins could assume power. Alia had ordered the execution of all traitors: Steersman Edric, Reverend Mother Mohiam, Kizzarat Korba and his Naib associates. The Kizzarat had dissolved. The clergy now obeyed Alia directly, just as all the Fremen Naibs did as well. Irulan wasn't executed though. Alia spared her because that woman now claimed that she had always loved Paul. Irulan wasn't loyal to the Bene Gesserit anymore, and thus, from within the Imperial court, there was no enemy left anymore. Paul, respecting the Fremen custom, would guarantee that the Fremen would never again turn against the Atreides, for the Atreides proved they were real Fremen of the desert, just like the rest of them. After Stilgar left, Alia came and sat with Duncan. Alia and Duncan promised to love each other to the end. Dune Messiah feels more like the last few chapters of Dune rather than a book of its own. I don't say this in a bad way, but what I mean is that this work concludes Paul's story and transitions into the characters that will be the focus of the next novel: Alia, Duncan, Leto II, and Ganima. In the end though, I do think that this is the weakest Dune book of them all. Again, not because it is bad, but due to how short it is, and how the other books are way more expensive and explore more themes and characters of which are more interesting to me. I just feel like this is the one to be ranked at the bottom. So if you like this video, consider subscribing and checking out my other videos on Dune. As of the making of this video, I have finished the complete story of Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune. The only one I'm missing is the original Dune, which I'll be making after this one. Some spoilers for you: it will probably be the longest video I'll ever make and the one I will have to edit the most. Heretics of Dune, being around 540 pages, ended up as a longer than 2 hours video, while Dune is, well, 650 pages long. I have already divided the chapters of the video, and it will be most definitely my video with the most chapters out of all the videos I'll ever make. At least until I make a full story of A Song of Ice and Fire. Anyway, that's a bunch of random crap probably nobody cares about, but I'll see you on my next video. Until then.